author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
First son gets a sweetheart deal, and it seems that China is playing big power games over in Cuba. All this and more on today's edition of Liberty Nation Radio right here on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. Remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting, brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution, the number one place for free thinking and free speech. The legal equivalent of a slap on the wrist for the president's son, Hunter Biden, for failing to pay taxes and gun crimes. Now, did the system work as it's supposed to, or is this yet more evidence that it's not what you've done, but who you know? Well, helping us figure out the facts is Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, and the greatest legal mind on this show right now, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire.
Thank you so much for that high praise, Mark. I appreciate it. It's a pleasure.
You're very, very welcome. I feel sorry for the other guy. So tell me, how good, if you could first, to our listeners, if they haven't encountered a TV, radio, or newspaper in the last couple of days, what is the deal, and just how good is it for Hunter Biden?
Oh, well, anytime that you can walk away from potential criminal liability without having incurred a custodial sentence or a felony conviction, boy, that's great, because those are the things that really hurt. Meaning, you know, the custodial sentence to the dignity and convenience and everything else. It's a real awful experience for anybody who has to undergo it. And a felony conviction makes a person oftentimes ineligible for all sorts of things in life, and lets them sort of be treated as not quite second-class citizens, but it's a bad look. And so to escape those two things is great, Mark.
Okay, and so let's talk about the crimes for which the deal that hasn't been finalized yet. We should point that out. There still has to be approved by a judge, but
this is a deal that was worked out by Mr. Weiss, who's the U.S. attorney for Delaware, and who works for Merrick Garland and Joe Biden, by the way, just in case somebody doesn't know. He made the deal.
Let's just reiterate that point for the cheap seats, Scott. The person who's come up with the deal works for
the father
Merrick
of
Garland,
the defendant,
Joe Biden,
and Merrick Garland, and of course the president of the United States, the father of Hunter Biden, and the boss of Mr. Weiss said basically, you know, my son did nothing wrong. He said that multiple times, so that's an interesting backdrop. But in any case, this is what we learned. We didn't learn about this. Part of the problem, Mark, about the entire affair, if you will, is the way it has been handled. And what I mean by that is because he's the president's son, and it's a political decision on whether or not to charge a person at all, and a political decision for which charges to seek if one does make a decision to charge, meaning, do we charge Hunter Biden with a crime, and are they felonies or misdemeanors? You know, those are both political judgment calls made by political appointees. It's not like we apply facts to some rubric of, metric, and like we come out the other end with a impartial call.
If
it is
A
partial.
plus B equals C,
right.
Do X and Y.
It's the opposite. This is a partial call, and there were crickets from the DOJ and the administration on this. They didn't talk about it at all, and the U.S. attorney didn't come out with an announcement and a press conference where he could be asked questions by the members of the media. Instead, how we learned about it was the U.S. attorney sent a letter to the federal court and said, we'd like a day on the docket, basically, to come in and enter this plea. And then if the plea is entered, that's a judicial approval, basically, of the arrangement. And through leaks, we presume from the prosecutor's office to legacy media companies, namely the Washington's most prominent newspaper, published a report that they will seek no time. That's why we're saying that Hunter won't go away, not because the letter says he won't go, but because the leaks from, again, presumably the prosecutor's office, which is itself a real problem and a crime that they're leaking this information. But in any case, they're saying that the deal includes no time for Hunter.
Okay, so I think I'd like to get on the phone here today, Mr. Wesley Snipes. Unfortunately, I can't. I don't have Mr. Snipes' number, but Mr. Snipes, if you are listening, do give us a call, because I believe Mr. Snipes, the famous actor, for those of you who don't know him, excellent in the Blade movies, among many others, got 3 years behind bars for similar tax arrangements, crimes, if you will.
Well, I don't know that they were similar. I know that he got some time. He had to serve federal prison sentence for failure to pay taxes, but I don't know if we can say, draw too many parallels. If you want, I will take leave of the program for 2 minutes and just take a look so I can comment more intelligently on Mr. Snipes.
No, you're all right. Okay. So I think the point I'm trying to make here, other than trying to get Wesley Snipes to give me a call and give me like a Blade autograph, is that most people who knowingly don't pay their taxes get some punishment that is above and beyond what Mr. Hunter Biden.
Well, I don't think it's fair to say. So I think it's more. Let's talk about the essential question. Is this a deal that Hunter Biden gets that other people don't get because they're not Hunter Biden? That's sort of, I think,
what's the answer?
The big question. And the answer is maybe. There are a number of facts here to yet discover for those of us that are interested in the nitty-gritty, Mark. And what they will reveal is what pains Mr. Biden took to conceal his income and to not pay what was legally required to in taxes. And if a person, for instance, establishes shell corporations in multiple countries in order to conceal funds and deals
I see what you did there, Scott. I see what you did there, referencing the numerous shell corporations,
non-dollar denominations, and all kinds of other measures. That is a different order entirely than somebody who simply needed to write a check and didn't write that check. Those are offenses of a different order. And so for those charges, I would say we need to discover more facts before we can truly discover, because it has been reported that that's what Mr. Biden did, engaged in that level of concealment in the fraud. But we don't know. It's all a black box. That might have been an important bit of information that a U.S. attorney, Mark, who's charging the son of the president of the United States exactly 1 week after his same Justice Department said that the former president of the United States should be incarcerated for the rest of his natural life, effectively, for mishandling some classified documents that cost the United States no penalty in, it's not like our intelligence posture has changed in any significant regard because of Donald Trump's mishandling of documents. Like, literally, there's no damage. Where's the victim? We don't have that. And at the same time, Hunter Biden seems like he gets off without so much as a by-year leave. So
let's briefly talk about the other crime to which he pleaded guilty, and that is being an admitted drug user.
It's for lying on a gun background check form,
which people go to prison for, right?
Sometimes
it's a sometimes and a maybe.
For it. Yeah, it's true. I can tell you this: the federal government has not been nearly as aggressive as they could be with enforcing this rule, and I want to be the first person to say, especially, I don't want them to be more aggressive. Sometimes it's a good thing when the federal government doesn't come after people. I would suggest for both of these crimes, maybe even liberty advocates might be interested in relaxed prosecution if it were applied across the board. Now, you can't have a situation, obviously, where Hunter gets a libertarian treatment from the prosecutor's office and the rest of us have to suffer through, micromanaging. But in any case, the federal firearms, I think it's a 4473. We were talking about this earlier in the week regarding another story, which is about the IRS seizing some forms from a gun dealer. But that's the form we're talking about. It includes, some basic biographical data about the application for purchase, the name, name, rank, and serial number, and then a number of questions, including, have you ever been adjudicated mentally incompetent? Are you now currently an unlawful user of or otherwise addicted to controlled substances, I think is how it defines what it says. And he said no, and he was. And then he wrote, I think in his biography or his autobiography, that he was at that time. So he states in print, that he. So in other words, if he didn't state it in print, they probably wouldn't even be charging him with it at all. And typically, other Americans, I don't think, would be charged with this crime. It's not a crime that we see a ton of prosecutions on. We don't see the federal government, for instance, Mark, going to California and saying, give us a list of all your medical marijuana card holders, and then juxtaposing that with a list of who has sought permission to buy a firearm, and then send agents out. I don't even want to say anymore. I want to give the administration ideas on how to frustrate gun ownership in the country, Mark. But even though Biden's administration has been hostile to gun rights, and more hostile than any administration since Barack Obama's, they're not doing their worst.
Yeah, they're not doing the worst that they could possibly be doing, and thank heavens for that, I guess.
Yeah.
Now, we'll be back with Scott DeCosenza after this short break, discussing whether Hunter Biden's legal troubles are truly over. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Liberty Nation's legal eagle, Scott DeCosenza, discussing the sweetheart deal for Hunter Biden's tax and gun crimes. Now, earlier in the show, we tackled the politics and the legal angles. But now I actually want to discuss if his troubles are actually over. Now, Scott, congressional Republicans, they're saying that they're still investigating Hunter Biden and the Biden family writ large for other crimes. So am I right in thinking that if the judge approves this deal that's being put forward by Mr. Weiss, then Hunter can't be charged with the same things again, as in like a double jeopardy situation?
Hunter Biden can't be charged again by the federal government for these same crimes. Now, the reason why I stated it that way is because if somebody does an act that could be a state crime and a federal crime, then that can be prosecuted in both a state court and a federal court in what I and many others believe is a misreading of our Constitution. But in any case, that's the state of the law. So if I were to, for instance, or somebody else, definitely not me, Mark, somebody else was to encounter a congressperson that they disliked intensely and they slapped them in the face, they would probably be prosecuted at the state level for assault, but they could also be, I'm sure there's some special federal law about striking a congressperson. They could be prosecuted federally for that crime as well.
So Representative Comer, he's, as we discussed, he's going after the Biden family money trail, as it's called, talking about the shell corporations that have been set up either by a Biden family member or for the specific usage by a Biden family member. Now, this in no way has anything to do with what's just happened in Delaware, right? So this is something that's going to be
the only thing that Hunter Biden is immune from with respect to future charges is not having reported fully instances of income that occurred in 2017 and 2018 and lying on one single gun application. Basically, that's all. So they can't charge him with that. But anything else, this has nothing to do with the laptop or any data that were discovered on there. This has only to do with 2 years of income and a certain amount of unreported income and one instance of lying on this form. That's it. This is not this is not some future proofing for Hunter Biden with more respects. I think, except for maybe it gives some legacy media types the impetus to say, this has been dealt with. It has nothing to do with Joe Biden.
That is such a common refrain. This is something that's been dealt with, or it's been debunked without ever actually pointing out the debunking. Yeah. It's almost a panacea for an uncomfortable question. That should the, let's call it the legacy media, ever deign to try and answer the questions that are brought about. Now, let's shift just politically for a second here. Hunter Biden, he's been dealt with by law on these things. He hasn't been dealt with in whatever investigation, whatever crimes attempt to be brought up or brought forward by the investigation by the GOP Congress. But this has to hurt Joe Biden politically, doesn't it?
Well, gee, Mark, I would think so. What should really hurt, from my perspective, what should hurt him politically more than his son's tax evasion and disrespect for the nation's firearm laws is that he thinks it's okay to charge Donald Trump with crimes that should put him in prison until he's dead, and then let his kid go without so much as a by your leave, and not really talk about it, and not have this sort of come to Jesus moment about the existential issues that this presents. I think, hoping that it just gets a pass. And those legacy media types seem to be giving him that pass. I saw on the most recent Tucker Carlson show episode where he talks about how they sort of pre-cleared this announcement. And so even more than a month ago, in interviews where journalists were stating, this doesn't involve you, but your son may have to face some consequences here. Like, announcing ahead of time that this has nothing to do with the president himself. This is only about his issue.
Let's very, very quickly, if I may, Scott, I just want to check something with you about Donald Trump, as you just mentioned him, and he's facing these 37 charges. And one of the most damaging pieces of evidence that we discussed that was put forward by the person bringing the prosecution was that he had spoken, and there was a recording of him talking about this, I could have declassified this, blah, blah, blah. And that when we discussed that together, we thought, well, that's going to be some quite damaging evidence. But in a recent interview with Fox's Bret Baier, he said that I was holding a newspaper and I was talking about a newspaper story. Now, he said that.
So the conversation that you're talking about, just so people understand, this was quoted in the indictment itself. They included a transcript of the relevant portion of that conversation. So just to be clear, it wasn't just that you and I thought this was going to be a key moment. Sure. The prosecutors say this is the key moment right here. Here's the goods. This wasn't about just some rando document that he mishandled. Like, here he is right here disclosing some national secret document. And I saw the portion of the interview that you're talking about where he basically says, and so that differs entirely from what we learned in the indictment. We're gonna find out, more information as that goes forward. But one of the things that Mr. Trump will probably learn is that these these interviews will be part of the evidence that's presented against him. And it is like any lawyer would tell his client, don't talk about this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, this is, first of all, you shouldn't talk about it at all. But if you want to say you've been prosecuted unfairly and you're in the middle of a presidential race, then okay, obviously fine. But in terms of the specific charges, what happened in a specific meeting, that if that's going to be examined in court, and certainly it will be because of the indictment and the attention that was paid to that conversation, Mark, he's got to stop talking about it. It's shocking, quite honestly.
Scott, I don't think he's going to stop talking about it.
Yeah.
Anyway, we'll be back after this short break with Scott Cosenza talking liberty. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Scott D. Cosenza for a special Talking Liberty segment. Now, as our listeners know, this is the time when we talk about all the things that impact your liberty. But I want to go a little broader for this particular segment, if you don't mind. Scott, thanks for being back with us.
Cheers, Mark.
So the first thing I want to discuss today was there are yet again articles of impeachment against Joe Biden.
Yes, Lauren Boebert has, is it the third time, filed articles of impeachment against Joseph Robinette Biden Jr.
Now, I find this pretty interesting, right? Because this is not the first time that articles of impeachment have been filed against the current president, the former Vice President Joe Biden, as many people like to call him. But they don't seem to be gaining steam. Now, this makes me wonder what's really happening. The Republicans, they have a majority in the House. Why don't they just vote on it? They did it to President Trump. And let's be fair, the two Trump impeachments, at least one of them was just spite, right? So why don't they just do it just to show that they can?
Well, I'm a better legal analyst than I am a political one, but as I put on my political analyst hat, I would say that they are perceiving that the country's appetite for an impeachment is not to their benefit, and the congressional the House Republican leaders don't want to move it forward, and so it's getting traction from the rabble rousers, the sort of
The Freedom
bomb
Caucus
throwers
lot,
like
as they call it.
like Ms. Boebert, but that the more mainstream people maybe don't want it, and it could just be for their own short-term political interest, or they could be trying to play chess with it and making it about their more long-term political interest. But
Well,
I assume that people act in their own self-interest, and
rather
so
than what their
and so
voters
that's why
want.
Ms. Boebert filed the articles, and that's
Yeah.
why we won't be hearing more about them probably, because of all those
Well,
actors.
almost certainly. There was also the recent a move against Adam Schiff to censure him and fine him for which were blatant lies. I don't think we need to use the words alleged here. He lied to the American people about having seen concrete evidence that's beyond circumstantial of Russian collusion. Anyway, there's a litany of things that we could talk about. And so Adam,
of all the people who are still able to maintain office, given what they've said, that does stagger. It does. I mean,
it does.
Yeah.
There were 20 Republicans that I believe it's 20 that voted not to censure Mr. Schiff for that. And I have to wonder, Scott, because could it be because, I mean, this is very speculative, but could it be because they think, well, if he gets this big fine and this censure for lying to the American people and for costing the American people millions of tax dollars for what essentially was a political witch hunt, do they worry that the same thing will happen to them when they inevitably do it themselves, or have already done it themselves and just don't want to be found out for doing it?
That it was that the vote was as close as it was is more surprising, Mark. Politicians lie as a matter of course. We all know it. They know it. I mean, and so it absolutely is a matter of self-preservation. I think to
the Self-Preservation Society. There's in my country, the United Kingdom of England, when Parliament is in session, if a parliamentarian says something, he is immune from prosecution or liable.
This is true for members of the United States Congress. 4 statements made in Congress, not in front of microphones at his district office, or on a phone. So
that's
with
the same thing.
Okay,
you can say what you like as long as you say it on the floor of the people's house.
Yes.
Yeah. So why do people not go more for censure in Congress, do you think? Why do they avoid it? Because we haven't heard about big censure issues in the last 6 years. Despite,
I love this question. Yeah.
And please carry on.
Well, I just think that the answer is because behind the scenes, so many of them are just, they're pals. They're running the same grift. They're about their own power and aggrandizement and having a say in our nation's affairs. And the idea that they're, citizens fighting for what's right as they represent their neighbors in the people's house is, I think, real fiction. Maybe I'm a cynic, but that seems to
a cynic or a realist, two sides of the same coin there. Now, another liberty issue that I think is really animated the entire nation, if not the world. This is making, which story I'm talking about here, and this is kind of making the rounds all over the world. And that is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the presidential candidate, son of Bobby Kennedy, was on the Joe Rogan podcast, and he was talking about certain harms that certain vaccines do.
Well, Mark, let me just stop you right there and let's get a quick rundown of what happened. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about vaccines, among other things. They criticized Dr. Hotez, I think it is.
Peter Hotez.
And who's a Texas doctor of great credentials and esteem. He's not just a doctor, but he's a professor of medicine. I think he founded one of the schools of medicine at the college, the medical campus where he is. He's really, has all the credentials. So it's not just some guy. But they were criticizing him. He had been on Rogan's podcast himself earlier, and is a vaccine advocate, but also he kind of dispensed with the idea that people should exercise or take vitamins or any of the other things that made for good health outcomes. And so Rogan was critical of him. And then what he did was Dr. Hotez, after RFK's appearance, basically tweeted out that Rogan was like not neo-fascist, but like akin or neo-fascist adjacent or something like that. It was really a dirty kind of tweet and linked to this Vice article, Vice Media article that was uncritical or critical in an unserious way. And so Rogan, who doesn't use Twitter to post often, but does have still 11 million followers because he is a monster on with social media, basically said, "Hey, I can't believe you did this. Let's debate this. Come on the show. I'll give you, I think $100,000 is what he started with to come on and debate this. Donate to a charity
of his choice,
of Hotez's choice, though." And that created a pile-on situation. I think it's well over 2 million now. There are a couple of Twitter users that are adding up because what happened is independent actors came in and said, Andrew Tate, for instance, famous social media influencer, said he would add $500,000 to the kitty. Other folks have added significant amounts of dough.
And that's if Dr. Hotez will debate RFK on vaccines.
The topic of vaccine safety on the Joe Rogan podcast. And he has declined and rebuffed and not just that, but basically shamed the invitation. And there's this effort. It's such a hilarious thing. They're so afraid of it. And I think that given the implications for liberty that we had with the vaccine and pushing for it, we're going to have a reckoning in our society about these people who, demanded that liberty be so restricted for what we now know they often didn't think were real benefits. That's part of the thing. It's one thing if a person, misunderstood the data or didn't understand things, but that's not exactly what we're dealing with here. And I think it just shows the bankruptcy of his, his views. I mean, is there an issue that you feel strongly about that you wouldn't like to give $2 million away to, worthwhile causes? And what's the worst thing that can happen?
I would debate an issue I didn't feel strongly about to give away $2 million to worthwhile causes.
And the biggest penalty you can suffer is some public embarrassment for not being a fact expert, maybe on one of the things. It's preposterous. And I think, anytime people go out of their way to explain why it's not important to question something or why they don't have to explain something, especially when the thing that you want to explain is extraordinary. Extraordinary claims, require extraordinary evidence. I think that's the rule that we should have. And if we're going to stop, all of our society because of the pandemic and the response, well, then I think it's, incumbent upon those who want that to happen to be able to say, okay, here's why we did all this. This is what was important.
It's almost as though you're suggesting people take some responsibility, Scott. Scott DeCosenza, thanks for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
China on America's doorstep. That's the potential issue facing the U.S., courtesy of new plans to build a Chinese facility on the coast of Cuba, just 100 miles from American borders. Now, to discuss the implications of this, what the administration is doing, if anything, we're joined by Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, former U.S. Air Force pilot, and former Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Controller, Mr. Dave Patterson. Dave, thanks for being here.
Mark, happy to be with you, always.
So, Dave, China in Cuba, strategically, is this a good thing for America or not? Well, I know the answer, right? But why specifically is it such a bad thing?
Well, strategically and tactically, it's a bad idea. I mean, and the only reason that the Chinese feel emboldened to do this is because they have no pushback. They see that the Biden administration has demonstrated an unwillingness to take them on either publicly or behind the scenes. Most recently, our Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was snubbed at the beginning of June at the Shangri-La dialogue when the Minister of Defense of China, Li Shangfu, just basically said, no, we're not going to talk about military to military talks. And so you get a background that where China isn't persuaded by the United States to do anything that would be either mutually beneficial or to give a nod to the U.S. in any way. The new revelation recently revealed in, I believe, the Wall Street Journal this morning that China is in discussion with Cuba on building a joint training base in Cuba, which will, of course, involve hundreds of Chinese coming in to do that. That's troubling. I mean, it's 100 miles, as you said, from the United States, but it should be expected.
Yes, yeah, I think that's really the takeaway from it, is that whatever China wants to do, it can do, because there is no significant pushback. And I mean, it seems to me, and I do have quite a lengthy and full experience with China. I lived there for many years, but it seems to me that the real win here is not that there's a military base going to be. Well, essentially, that's what it is—a training facility for military. So it's a military base just off the coast of America. The big win here is the propaganda win, isn't it? Because China can say to its people, you think America's this big, strong power. Look, we're putting our soldiers, we're putting our equipment, our weaponry, even our missiles. Who's going to stop them if they put missiles there? On the doorstep of America, and they're not doing anything about it. This is how strong we are, and that's how weak America is. It's a big propaganda win back home, isn't it?
Absolutely. And they have a target audience that they're talking to, the non-aligned nations, those nations who might favor China in trade. That's who they're talking to. And they're winning the propaganda war. There's no question about that. Again, General Li Shangfu had 35 minutes to talk to the group at the Shangri-La dialogue, and he just excoriated the United States in every possible way with propaganda that was just ridiculously inaccurate. Have you ever heard that Lloyd Austin talked at the Shangri-La dialogues?
No.
I mean, we don't understand that this is, in fact, a Cold War, just like it was with the Soviet Union, and we need to behave similarly. And of course, we know how that worked out for us. And so why wouldn't it work out similarly for the United States with China? It's not significantly different, other than you have a much greater economic prowess. But then, think back, and during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was a fairly strong economic power in and of itself. It kind of imploded, but other than, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were a powerhouse to be reckoned with.
Well, I think a lot of people are, at least in the backs of their minds, are thinking about the similarities to the Cold War situation, and specifically the missile crisis, because obviously you had Russia essentially using Cuba to further, the Soviet Union using Cuba to further the Soviet Union's aims, and to be pushing the buttons of America by the warships and being in such close quarters and such a threat. And really, that shaped very much the American psyche during the period, with stop, drop, and cover, hide under the desks when the missiles come. Are they trying to mentally break the American public?
I think they're trying to put the American public and the current administration just simply off their game, and they're succeeding, I might add.
Yeah.
Whenever you'll notice that in public statements, some of the first phrases they use is, "We need to We're not in a Cold War mentality. We're not bringing back the Cold War way of thinking. And they say this over and over and over. And when they say something, that means, well, yeah, we are. We are in a Cold War. And of course, if you dissuade us from thinking that way, then we'll be less prepared mentally to deal with them. And that's what they're trying to do. And I mean, this is all part of their plan. And they've got another plan that Cuba fits right into, Project 141. They're trying to surround the United States with facilities and places where they can be a presence. Not long ago, Gordon Chang, an expert on China, pointed out that a Chinese company was building a deep water port in the Bahamas. And everybody says, oh, yeah, look, a deep water port in Bahamas, duh. Well, and now you've got a facility going
just to make this very clear, fancy yachts don't require a deep water port, right? We're talking.
Yes, I've been told that, and fishing boats, but they're also doing the same thing in Djibouti. They're also doing the same thing in the United Arab Emirates. Everywhere you look, there are Chinese people present doing things that are not in the United States' best interest. Not long ago, they took out an agreement for Canton Island in the Pacific. It has a real long runway. We used to have a naval base there, but now it's going to be Chinese. Well, this is ridiculous. And I might add that most of this has happened during this administration and not previous administrations.
So I think the big question is, Dave, is why is the Biden administration so hesitant to engage in let's call it a strong diplomacy? That Donald Trump, for all of his faults, I'm not entirely sure he achieved very much other than winning the propaganda victory against China. He was always talking about, we got to go after China. China are doing this, China are doing that. But it's a completely stark difference under the Biden administration. I'm wondering if, in terms of how the American people see the situation now, if it's just been cast away as, well, we don't really care what the American people think of the situation because, the adults are back in charge. And if China wants to do this, well, they can. It just seems a complete jetsoning of responsibility.
It's a fundamental foreign policy philosophy that the current administration has. And it's emblematic of the notion that, oh, if we be really nice to you, will you be nice to us, please? And it may sound silly, but when you start to unpack the way in which they approach our enemies, that's precisely their attitude. If we're nice to you, Iran, will you be nice to us? If we try to engage in behind the scenes, very quiet negotiations to get back to the failed nuclear treaty or nuclear agreement, will you be nice to us? It has never worked in the history of the foreign policy. That approach has never worked.
It's feeding the alligator in the hopes that it will eat you last. Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Hey, Mark, thank you. Enjoyed talking with you.
And that's about all we have time for on Liberty Nation Radio here on the Radio American Network this week. My thanks to our guests, Scott DeCosenza and Dave Patterson, and to you, the listeners at home. A final thought for you. Winston Churchill once said, the price of greatness is responsibility. And it seems to me that nowadays, not too many people are willing to pay that particularly high cost. Thanks for listening. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. we believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.